In this video, I'm going to walk you through Unit 5, Day 9 and 10, Japanese internment camps. This lesson is a two-part lesson, and it's a pretty long, dense one, so there's several other videos after this to continue explaining certain parts. There are a couple of resources before I move past the first slide, and they're all in the student workbook. The graphic organizer that's mentioned later in the lesson is student workbook page 44, and the case files that are used in this lesson and in lesson 10 are in student workbook pages 35 to 43. I also created a separate document that's a Google document, so it's something that students can actively use online, which will replace both of those documents from the student workbook. But if you wanted to use the PDF, that's available for you in the Passport to Social Studies Google Drive. So there is some important notes here that you definitely shouldn't skip over, and it's really this one's really talking about that the process of teaching Japanese internment can be hard history. It's not something that we should gloss over, and it also needs to be handled with care. So there's some resources there from Facing History to prep yourself to talk about Japanese internment during World War II. On this slide, there's two sources here for you if you want to provide students with more background information. The lesson itself is more of a discovery model. So students are given a bunch of documents and they're doing the discovery. There is not a lot of content that you give them. So if you want them to have a little more content before going in, or if you feel like they're not getting it from the documents, these are two sources: Children in Internment Camps, A Japanese American Reflection, and Children of the Camps, Internment History. There's a lot of sources available out there too. And this is just another source about the lives of the people in the internment camp. Okay, the lesson objective is that they will evaluate the reasons for Japanese internment by completing a crime investigation activity utilizing primary and or secondary sources. It starts off just by a little hook question here to talk about detectives and what methods they use to solve crimes. Hopefully the students will incorporate into their own work. And then it goes on to talk about the U.S. actions after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. So students should be looking for motive and for who was responsible. The documents are delivered in the same way that they are on this slide, but this is what you're doing with them as a guide. So for the model. So this is document number 1. All the documents are labeled case file 1942 to 1945, document number, and this is from the Munson report. So if you're leading this with students, I would probably read this aloud to them. It's a pretty dense document, and it doesn't really talk about what exactly Japanese internment was. So again, if kids are coming into this with no content, you can either go with this kind of mystery of you're trying to figure out what Japanese internment was, why it happened, what was the reasoning given, what's the actual reason, or you can give them some content and context before you jump into these documents. I think that's really up to you and whether you and what you know about your students. If you're taking a look at my next video, I'll walk you through the document I made in which I give some answers to these questions about who committed the crimes and where they take place. Students will work on this one with you, so they should be looking at the document, answering the questions. If you're using the Google slide deck and having kids fill in their answers, they should do so in this blue box here. And then you would go over it together as a class. You can also just do this as a model completely because they will be doing quite a lot of document work on their own in the independent section. So they'll be gathering information about the who, when, where, what, and then also the why and how of Japanese internment during World War II. And again, that can be found in the student workbook, or it can be found on the document I'll be sharing with you at the end of this video and in the next video. Again, some directions here for students. They will be analyzing documents 2 to 5 and gathering evidence, which they can then add into the graphic organizer. And then it jumps into the documents. So each of these documents, again, is pretty dense. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about them here because I do that in the next video, but I do want to talk about a couple of things. One, like I said before, there's not a lot of context for what Japanese internment was before these documents. So if you are concerned that your kids really won't have an understanding of this, the last document for this day, for day 9, and I'm just skipping ahead to it. This is document 5, and it's a secondary source from ushistory.org, and it really is a pretty straightforward description of what Japanese internment was, when it happened, how many Japanese Americans were affected, and it discusses FDR's role in it. So if you wanted to move this to the beginning to give students a bit more context, you can, but that does kind of get rid of a lot of the exploratory investigative aspects of this lesson. So it's really up to you. And that's really it for day 9. So they have these 4 documents that they're going to work on their own. You guys did number 1 together, and then they're going to work on 2, 3, 4, and 5 on their own. And then they have a wrap up for the day. So at the wrap up, they are just kind of making their observations based on the evidence that they gathered.